This micro lecture is going to be on ideology and hermeneutics, Gnosis, Agnosis, Dialogos, and Sophia. Hermeneutics comes from the Greek Hermes. Hermes was the god who often used to deliver the message, the truth, the insights of Zeus to the people in Athens and whatever. And so there was the sense of he's interpreting. Hermes is the god of interpreting the message of the Olympians for the world of humans, men, women, the city-states in Macedonia at the time, the various Greek city-states. So when we think ideology and interpretation, or the word can be used also epistemology, it's just another Greek word, episteme. We looked earlier at Michel Foucault's word of episteme, which means a worldview, an interpretive worldview in that sense. And so inevitably we are always engaged in interpreting things. Those forms of interpretation can come from our family, our temperament, our culture, our friends, our education, those we associate with. And a thoughtful person ideologically is always trying to say, what is the validity? What may be the limitations? What might be the blind spots? What is revealed to me in my upbringing, my peers, those who I associate with, but what is concealed from me? And the task of good thinking is often, to use Heidegger's phrase, to unconceal that which is concealed, or bring into being ways of understanding things a little deeper or more meaningfully. So, ideology and hermeneutics, or interpretation, I'll linger here a little bit, and I want to focus on four areas. I touched on earlier the difference between Techne and P.A.I as ways of knowing, and I want to walk a little further down the path with that with you on this particular lecture. As mentioned earlier, Techne is within the Greek or classical civilization was an understanding of education in which a person would be trained with a particular skill that then they could offer to the polis or the community. And those skills could be anything as basic as carpentry, electrician, the farmer who knew their skills, raising sheep properly, or it could be more sophisticated skills, lawyer, doctors, dentists, mechanics. There are a variety of skills people can learn, and then they offer it back to the community, the polis that they live in. The understanding of technique also, and I'm just going to move a little direction here, was that Techne offered knowledge, or gnosis. Gnosis is a Greek word, to know, to have the knowledge which is needed to accomplish the task before us. Gnosis, Techne, and a puzzle mind are very, very important to understand here. A puzzle mind, or gnosis, or Techne, is a mind in which there's a project to be fulfilled, there's a goal to be attained, and we have the knowledge needed to accomplish that goal. So at a fairly elementary level, if someone wants to bake some cookies, you get the recipe, you put things together, you put them in an oven, and if you follow the proper information or knowledge, the cookies come out, they're tasty, one and all enjoys it. That's at a fairly elementary level. A little more sophisticated level, we want to build Portman Bridge. People with the knowledge, the engineers, bring together their knowledge, the best of the engineers and people in construction, and through applying their technique, their knowledge, the puzzle is solved, the bridge is built, and cars drive across it. Up the level a little more, you want to put a spaceship into space. People have to have some background in gravity, and science, and physics. The gnosis needed to accomplish the task, to sort out the puzzle of how you put the spaceship into space, get it out of the gravitational field. That is the realm of gnosis, of knowledge. Knowledge being applied to achieve a certain goal that brings certain results, and all the pieces of the puzzle come together and the goal is accomplished. So the world of Techne, the world of gnosis, or knowledge, is something, or the puzzle mind in that sense, is that if we just have the knowledge that is needed, we can fix the problem and the goal will be achieved throughout over a certain period of time. And where there are miscues or things happen, we just haven't had the adequate knowledge needed to accomplish the goal the goal that we set before ourselves. Now, those are practical issues in which Techne, Gnosis, puzzle mind come together to accomplish a goal. What underlies that in terms of a presupposition is, in fact, that if people have the proper knowledge, they can sort out the puzzle, solve the problems, and good will emerge. Now, when we begin to apply that way of thinking, a technical way of thinking, a gnosis way of thinking, a puzzle way of thinking, to politics, to religion, to education, to the media, to economic issues, the danger is to think, if I just have the right knowledge, I will be right. Those who differ with me are wrong, and there are implications of that. So we looked at briefly in this course various forms of gnosis at work. So if we could go back to the 16th century, Luther thought he had the gnosis, the true interpretation of the Bible. The Catholics didn't, and so the break between Protestant Christianity, what was to become Protestant Christian Catholicism. Calvin thought he had the true gnosis of interpreting the Bible. Luther didn't in quite the same way, and so the break between the Reformed and Lutherans. The Anabaptists thought they had the true gnosis, and hence their break with the Lutherans, Reformed, and Roman Catholic. Fast forward a little bit, then we have science thinks they have, and remember, science comes from Latin scientia, which is to know, it's knowledge, it's gnosis in that sense. So scientists thought they had the true knowledge, and they were going to bring into being the better, the greater world, and religion could not accomplish the task in quite the same way. Science and eventually technology, which would emerge from that. Remember, technology comes from techne, technical education in that sense. It's the reflections about how techne accomplishes its particular goals. We can see some of the great political events of the 20th century unfolding in the same way. The fascists thought they had the true knowledge, and the communists and the liberal democratic tradition didn't. And so they were right, and the other political economic traditions weren't. You get the liberal democratic tradition with its gnosis, and that communism is the problem, Nazism and fascism is not the true knowledge. We can also look at how, for example, the way gnosis works in other elements of politics and the way knowledge is used. So, if, for example, in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the Zionist tradition will argue, given what has happened to Jews in history, they are the true interpreters of what should happen in Palestine, and the Palestinians are the problem. They're the terrorists, Hamas, or groups like this. We can move forward. An interesting one would be to look at when we look at history is in terms of the Sikh tradition. How is that 1984 situation interpreted? If a person comes from a Sikh tradition, an ideological Sikh tradition, then of course the Indian government of Indira Gandhi is the one who was belligerent, aggressive, and the Sikh were the victims. Person came from the Indian perspective of Indira Gandhi. They were doing what they had to do to prevent greater secessionism in the Punjab. This is gnosis. People who know and people who don't agree with them proves they don't know. We can see this played out in certain forms we would have looked at a little earlier, certain reads of right-wing Islam. What will be done if a person's on a strong jihadist tradition, what they will do in terms of bringing into being what they will argue is the authentic forms of the Muslim heritage. They know. They're the ones in the know, and they're quite willing to use violence. The United States, seen itself in its origins as the New Jerusalem, they are the ones who know as we move into the future, and their version of liberty and democracy is the one that must be exercised throughout the world. So also we could look at within the elements of the Sikh tradition, the chair created at UBC in the late 1980s. They appointed a particular person to teach Sikh studies. It was being taught in a way that offended the Sikh guardian class. Huge clash took place. He was removed from his chair, and so that Sikh chair is no more. Gnosis, in terms of who defines what is authentic reality, and if people differ with that, then they're usually marginalized. So Gnosis, in that sense, when it moves from practical issues, the theory, the underlying premises remain in terms of a hermeneutic, but the certainty that people want in the applied areas of, say, bridge building and putting rockets in space or baking cookies in that sense, or even mathematics, 1 and 1 equals 2, 2 and 2 equals 4, these sort of issues, they bring certainty. They want those same levels of certainty applied in the political, the religious, the educational spheres. And so Gnosis is something that is very important to understand as an ideological interpretive construct. Underneath it is the need for certainty, absolute certainty, and those who differ with the particular interpretation of a political ideology, a religious ideology, educational ideology, then they're seen as betrayers, as Judases, people who are denying the authentic core of any tradition. Now, many people who have been raised in some form of a Gnostic tradition, whether political or religious, educational, denominationally, and they have seen the implications where it leads in terms of a shrinking of reality and how they define their own religious tradition, their political tradition. For example, even in politics in Canada, the NDP, the Greens, the Liberals, the Conservatives, the Bloc. These are all Gnostic interpretations of how reality is to be made sense of when applied in the public sphere, and those who differ with them, they break into their own, as it were, religious denominations, just secularized. All political parties are just secularized religious denominations with interpretive Gnostic approaches in which reality shrinks to a certain hermeneutic interpretation. Now, those who have often uncritically either been raised in a certain Gnostic context in which reality is explained to them in simple terms, there are no questions asked, even when you, for example, sacred texts of, say, Islam or the Sikh tradition, they're meant to be read devotionally. Now, if a person says, well, how is this text put together? And can this text be read differently? And what are different interpretations? This then can raise the Gnostic ire of the guardians of the tradition, in which critical questions cannot be asked. And this is what one always knows. You're in a Gnostic context when no critical questions can be asked amongst those who are the interpreters of a religious, political, educational, you name it, heritages. Now, often the reaction to Gnosticism, when people have been in it, they've seen people hurt, seen people betrayed, nasty things have been said to one another, new temples, new churches, synagogues, mosques, gurdwaras are built as a result of these Gnostic conflicts, and they see the pain that comes from that. They then often will go to the other extreme, which is agnosis or agnosticism. And agnosticism, anytime we get an alpha in a Greek word, it negates what goes before. So the agnostic tradition takes the position that we really can't know anything. All is only perspective. There is no right, wrong. There is no good, better, best in a substantive sense. We just have people, all victims of Hermes' diverse interpretations and what it means. And so the agnostic position, or the cynical position, or the skeptical position is often a reaction to the Gnostic position, in which the shrinking of ideas leads to conflicts between people, between communities, fragmentation, and people who've grown up in that think, well, I'm not going to be committed to anything anymore because I see the implications of Gnostic thinking in families, in communities, in educational institutions, religion, and politics. In a variety, it can be in sports, it can be in anything really. And so the agnostic position or the cynical position is one that is taken. Interesting enough, when agnosticism becomes its own absolute, it's just another form of Gnosticism. I know that nobody can know. And so the agnosticism, often when people are agnostic ideologically, they're just new types of Gnostics, that's all. They just take the position that I know that nobody can know. And so that's interesting enough. Friedrich Nietzsche, in his great work, Thus Spake Zarathustra, had a great deal to say about cynics or agnostics, called them leeches. One sense, soothsayers who could the only thing they could plead or hold high was a negative view, a critical view of everything, but they lacked the ability to creatively and constructively think how a person leads a meaningful, full life. And the 4 books and Thus Spake Zarathustra, everyone should know Thus Spake Zarathustra. Very, very important work in terms of how both Nietzsche deconstructs certain forms of Gnosticism, but he also deconstructs agnosticism, cynicism, skepticism. He feels it's for the feeble-minded, the weak, the leeches, what he calls his apes in that sense. They seem to deconstruct like Zarathustra, but they lack the ability to creatively construct, bring into being something meaningful and new. Interestingly enough, when Nietzsche thinks of the Gnostics in that sense, in terms of people are very committed to a narrow interpretation of something, and they're very intense about it. It can be on the progressive left or the social justice warriors or the alt or light right. He compares them, the word is Feuerhund. They're like firehounds. They bark and they breathe fire at those who differ with them. And so the Gnostic ideological tradition are like fire-breathing hounds. Those who differ with them, they'll burn them up. The flip side is the agnostic, which Nietzsche is equally critical of in Thus Spake Zarathustra. So he attempts to transcend the Gnostic, agnostic tradition in that sense. And so when we think of ideology and hermeneutics, the 2 wings which are problematic inevitably are the Gnostic and then the agnostic position, in which people take a position in which nothing can truly be believed with any substantive seriousness, and the best position to take is cynicism. And Nietzsche, as I mentioned earlier, just sees this as another form of Gnosticism, and people lacking any depth or creative ability to construct thoughtful ways of moving forward. And of course, ideology is always about not only diagnosis, here we have gnosis again, but prognosis, moving forward with more in-depth understanding. This then leads to the next point of dialogos. In Greek tradition, we have our word ideology. Dialogos is just through the logos, people come to a better understanding of how they are to live together in families, as friends, in communities, politically. And dialogos, underneath the notion of dialogos, is be wary of the extremes of the Gnostic, who is too sure of themselves, and the extreme of the agnostic, who will take no position on anything other than nobody can take a position on anything. Dialogos essentially says, yes, as Shakespeare would say, modest doubt is a beacon of the wise. And so there's legitimate place for cynicism, but when it becomes an absolute, then you have cynics who are not cynical of cynicism. And so dialogos, the underlying notion is that each and all have the logos, deep truths within them, but each and all only know it imperfectly. Hence, people from different political perspectives or different interpretive traditions do best when they are willing to hear what they can hear at any given time within themselves, that is genuine, it's true, it's good, it's beautiful. But the other, who they see as the problem, as the enemy, as the opponent, they also have the logos in them. In the Greek tradition, it was called the logos spermatikos, the seed of reality is one and all. But most of us have not taken care of that garden of the seed of reality well. But there are certain flowers within that garden of the soul, multiple weeds as well. And so Gandhi once said, for example, the people I keep closest to me are my enemies. And there's a certain wisdom in that he could learn much from those who opposed him, the sternest or in the most confrontational way. So dialogos, in that sense, is about each and all, and particularly this is tested in its most obvious way, in which people from different political perspectives come together and are willing to recognize the good, the logos in the other, the insights they may have, and the limitations of their own perspective. And one always knows, in terms of ideology and politics, when a healthy step forward is being taken, in that you have a person is aware of their own limitations, their own perspectives, where there is goodness trying to emerge within them, but the other also has insight as well as blind spots. And so we are all, in that sense, as St. Paul would say, we see through a glass darkly, or as Tennyson, the great poet in his In Memoriam, mentioned very, very, very nicely. Our little systems have their they have their day, but cease to be. They are but broken lights of thee, and thou, Lord, art more than they. And so all our perspectives are broken lights in that sense, but there is light. And Dialogos is about the word, the light, the broken lights of different people coming together to create a fuller light. And this is why then Sophia, and we get our word philia, Sophia, is the way forward often, or the via media, when we think of ideology and politics, between the Gnostics, who are too sure, too certain of themselves on the one hand, and the agnostics, which make a virtue of uncertainty. Within the Sophic tradition, or philia Sophia, or political philosophy in that sense, there's a sense that what are those things which is important to be aware of for a meaningful life? The virtues, the vices, friendship, good, true, beautiful. But how do we see them imperfectly? So what is the wisdom of the agnostic? What's the blind spot of the agnostic? What's the wisdom of the Gnostic and the blind spots of the agnostic? In the Sophianic tradition of political philosophy and philosophy itself was a bringing together of the best of both sides, recognizing both were imperfect, and hence a healthy way of moving forward politically, so that one doesn't become trapped in forms of political tribalism, clannishness, partisan politics, but in fact there's a way of seeing and being which transcends all of these, while recognizing there are also goods and insights in each of them. So when we think of ideology and hermeneutics, important to understand the validity and limitation of the Gnostic perspective, the validity and limitation of the agnostic perspective. How does our understanding of the Dialogos, or through an interior openness to the Logos, or Heidegger would call Dasein, or openness to being, or Mitsein, being with one another, how do those come together in an older classical understanding of the Logos? This involves much hearing, attentiveness, gazing, receptivity. Simon Weil talks about attentiveness. It takes a lot of inner work to be attentive to others, particularly those who differ or collide with us the most. And then philia Sophia, which of course philia is four Greek words for love. It means friendships, ever in search of wisdom, particularly wisdom in the familial, the personal, the friendship levels, the community levels, and then larger, of course, international political levels. And so ideology and hermeneutics, Gnosis, Agnosis, Dialogos, and Sophia, very important to understand when we begin to, as we inch towards the end of this course in terms of politics and ideology.